In the shadowed heart of Thornwood Manor's ancient maze, a midnight riddle contest turns deadly when Sir Reginald Harrington is found murdered, his blood staining the moonlit pavilion. As secrets unravel and suspicions entwine the elegant guests, only Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming spinster from St. Mary Mead, can navigate the labyrinth of lies to uncover a killer hiding in plain sight. With every clue a twist and every motive a dead end, will she solve the mystery before the maze claims another victim? Chapter 1. The Gathering at Thornwood Manor. In the soft golden haze of a late summer afternoon, Thornwood Manor stood sentinel over the rolling hills of rural Kent, its ivy-clad walls whispering secrets of generations past. The estate, a sprawling Georgian masterpiece, with mullioned windows and chimneys that pierced the sky like ancient obelisks, had long been the jewel of the Harrington family. Sir Reginald Harrington, its current master, was a man of considerable means, and even more considerable eccentricities. At 72, he possessed the vitality of a much younger soul, though his sharp tongue and unyielding opinions often cast shadows over the polite society he commanded. The occasion for this particular gathering was Sir Reginald's annual garden fete, an event that drew the local gentry and a select few from London, all eager to bask in the opulence of Thornwood, while navigating the intricate social labyrinth that was the Harrington household. Yet, beneath the veneer of civility, tensions simmered like a kettle on a low flame. Sir Reginald had recently announced his intention to revise his will, a decision that had sent ripples of unease through his family and intimates. Whispers of disinheritance and favoritism floated through the air, as intangible yet pervasive as the scent of blooming roses from the formal gardens. Eleanor Prescott, a young woman of 28, with a keen eye and a disposition inclined toward quiet observation, arrived at Thornwood that afternoon in a modest motorcar driven by her cousin, the village doctor. Eleanor was not of the Harrington bloodline, but had been invited as a companion to Lady Harrington, Sir Reginald's second wife, who found in Eleanor's sensible nature a balm against the family's more volatile elements. Lady Amelia Harrington, née Beaumont, was a woman of delicate beauty and fragile nerves, her porcelain features often etched with a faint anxiety that spoke of unspoken burdens. At 45, she was considerably younger than her husband, a fact that did not escape the notice of the gossips in St. Mary Mead, the nearby village where Eleanor resided. As Eleanor stepped from the car onto the gravel drive, the crunch of pebbles underfoot seemed to echo the underlying brittleness of the scene. The manor loomed before her, its facade bathed in the warm light that belied the chill of impending autumn. Servants in crisp uniforms bustled about, directing guests toward the expansive lawns where white tents fluttered gently in the breeze. A string quartet played softly from the terrace, their melodies weaving through conversations laced with laughter that rang just a touch too forced. "Miss Prescott, how delightful that you've come," Lady Amelia greeted her, gliding forward with an elegance that masked her inner turmoil. Her voice was soft, almost tremulous, as she extended a gloved hand. "Reginald insists on these gatherings, but I confess, they exhaust me. Your presence will be a comfort." Eleanor smiled warmly, her dark eyes taking in the subtle lines of strain around Lady Amelia's mouth. "It is my pleasure, Lady Harrington. St. Mary Mead seems quite dull in comparison to Thornwood's splendor." They walked arm in arm toward the gardens, where the heart of the fete pulsed with activity. The estate's crowning glory was its legendary hedge maze, a vast labyrinth planted over a century ago by Sir Reginald's great-grandfather. It sprawled across several acres, its tall yew walls forming twisting paths that led to a central pavilion adorned with marble statues of mythical figures. Local legend spoke of lovers lost within its confines, emerging hours later with flushed cheeks and secrets sealed. Today, the maze was open for exploration, its entrances marked by garlands of flowers. Though Sir Reginald had decreed a midnight riddle contest within its depths, a whimsical challenge with a substantial prize for the victor. Among the guests, milling about the lawns, were the principal members of the Harrington circle, each a study in concealed motives and polished facades. First, there was Victor Harrington, Sir Reginald's son from his first marriage. At 40, Victor was a handsome man with a military bearing, his moustache impeccably trimmed and his eyes harboring a perpetual glint of resentment. He had served in the Great War and returned with medals but little fortune, relying on his father's largesse to fund his London pursuits. Victor stood near the refreshment table, conversing animatedly with a cluster of admirers, though Eleanor noted how his gaze frequently darted toward his father, who held court on the terrace. Beside Victor hovered his wife, Clarissa Harrington, a vivacious woman of 35, whose laughter pealed like crystal bells. Clarissa's gowns were always the height of fashion, sourced from Paris salons, and her wit was as sharp as her ambitions. Rumors in the village suggested that her marriage to Victor was one of convenience, her eyes often lingering on more prosperous prospects. She sipped champagne with practiced grace, her free hand resting lightly on her husband's arm, a gesture that seemed possessive rather than affectionate. Then there was Lydia Beaumont, Lady Amelia's younger sister, a spinster of 30, with a scholarly bent and a tongue that could cut like a scalpel. Lydia resided at Thornwood as a permanent guest, her presence tolerated by Sir Reginald for the sake of family harmony. She was an avid botanist, often seen tending the greenhouse, or wandering the maze with a notebook in hand. Today, she wore a sensible tweed suit, her hair pinned severely, and engaged in a heated discussion with the estate's gardener about the pruning of the hedges. Eleanor had met Lydia before, and found her intellect formidable, though her manner bordered on abrasive. Completing the inner circle was Desmond Forbes, Sir Reginald's business partner and a man of enigmatic charm. At 50, Forbes possessed a sleek, fox-like quality, his silver hair and tailored suits exuding an air of calculated sophistication. He had made his fortune in colonial investments and now shared in the Harrington enterprises. Though whispers of financial discrepancies had begun to circulate, Forbes stood apart from the throng, smoking a cigarette and observing the crowd with eyes that missed nothing. The outer guests included local notables, Reverend Thomas Hale, the vicar of St. Mary Mead, a kindly man in his 60s whose sermons emphasized forgiveness but whose own life bore the scars of a youthful indiscretion. Mrs. Eliza Grantham, a wealthy widow known for her charitable works and her penchant for meddling in others' affairs, and young Dr. Edmund Croft, Eleanor's cousin, who attended not only as her escort but as the family physician, his boyish face hiding a sharp medical mind that as the afternoon waned into evening, the sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows across the lawns. Sir Reginald himself descended from the terrace, his cane tapping rhythmically on the stone steps. He was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a mane of white hair and a voice that boomed like thunder. "Welcome, one and all, to Thornwood's humble fate," he proclaimed, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Tonight, as the clock strikes midnight, we shall venture into the maze for a riddle of my own devising. The prize, a sapphire brooch from my late mother's collection worth a king's ransom, I assure you." Murmurs of excitement rippled through the assembly, but Eleanor, standing beside Lady Amelia, sensed the undercurrent of unease. Victor's jaw tightened imperceptibly, smile faltered for a fraction of a second, and Lydia's eyes narrowed, as if calculating the odds. Forbes extinguished his cigarette with deliberate care, his expression unreadable. Dinner was served in the grand dining hall, a room resplendent with crystal chandeliers and portraits of stern ancestors gazing down upon the guests. The meal was exquisite: roast, pheasant, delicate aspics, and wines from the Harrington cellars, but conversation flowed with a forced joviality. Sir Reginald dominated the table, regaling all with tales of his youth in India, while subtly probing his companion's loyalties. "Tell me, Victor," he said at one point, his fork poised mid-air, "have you given thought to that position I mentioned in the firm, or do you prefer to fritter away your days in the city?" Victor flushed, his knife scraping against his plate. "Father, I assure you, my pursuits are far from frivolous, but perhaps we might discuss it privately." "Nonsense. We're all family here," Sir Reginald retorted, though his gaze swept the table, lingering on Forbes with a hint of accusation. Lady Amelia attempted to steer the conversation toward lighter topics, inquiring about the maze's history. "It's said to be modelled after the one at Hampton Court," she offered timidly. "Indeed," Lydia interjected, her voice crisp, "though ours is far more intricate. I've mapped it myself, every turn, every dead end, a veritable labyrinth of deception." Eleanor listened attentively, her mind noting the subtle barbs exchanged like hidden thorns in a bouquet. As coffee was served, the clock in the hall chimed 9, and guests began to drift toward the drawing-room for cards and conversation. Outside, the gardens grew dim, the maze a dark silhouette against the twilight sky. Lamps were lit along the paths, their flickering light promising adventure but also peril for those who might stray too far. Eleanor, retiring to the library for a moment of solitude, overheard a snatch of whispered argument between Victor and Clarissa in the corridor. He means to cut us out entirely, Victor hissed. That brooch is just a taunt. Patience, darling, Clarissa replied, her tone soothing yet edged. We'll find a way. Eleanor slipped away unnoticed, her heart quickening with a vague premonition. The night air, as she stepped onto the terrace, carried the scent of impending rain, and far off. Chapter 2. The crime. The clock in Thornwood Manor's great hall struck 11, its chimes reverberating through the oak-panelled corridors like a summons to judgment. The evening had grown heavy with anticipation, the guests' earlier merriment, now tempered by the looming midnight riddle contest in the maze. Outside, the air was thick with the promise of rain, and the lamps along the garden paths cast eerie shadows that danced like spectres across the manicured lawns. Eleanor Prescott, lingering in the drawing-room with a cup of tea, observed the subtle shifts in the company, tightened smiles, furtive glances, and the occasional sharp word, disguised as jest. The Harrington household, she sensed, was a tapestry of secrets, each thread pulled taut and ready to snap. Sir Reginald Harrington, ever the orchestrator of drama, stood by the French doors leading to the terrace, his silhouette framed against the darkening sky. He clapped his hands, drawing all eyes to him. My friends, the hour approaches, he declared, his voice rich with theatrical flourish. In 1 hour, we shall venture into the maze for my riddle contest. The sapphire brooch awaits the cleverest among your, perhaps the most daring. His eyes gleamed with a mischievous intensity, as if he relished the unease his words provoked. The guests murmured, some with excitement, others with apprehension. Victor Harrington, standing near the fireplace, drained his glass of brandy in one swift motion, his knuckles whitening around the crystal. Clarissa, beside him, adjusted her shawl with a practiced elegance, though Eleanor noted the slight tremor in her fingers. Lydia Beaumont, seated at a card table with Reverend Hale, pursed her lips, her pen scratching furiously in her notebook, as if solving the riddle already. Desmond Forbes, leaning against a bookcase, lit another cigarette, his gaze fixed on Sir Reginald with an intensity that bordered on predatory. Lady Amelia, pale and delicate in her lavender gown, hovered near her husband, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Reginald, must we go into the maze so late? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The weather seems uncertain, and the paths can be treacherous. Nonsense, my dear, Sir Reginald replied, patting her hand dismissively. A little adventure will do us all good. Besides, the lamps are lit, and the maze is perfectly safe. Isn't that so, Lydia? Lydia looked up, her expression sour. Safe for those who know its turns, she said curtly. I've warned you before, Reginald, about those loose stones near the pavilion. They're a hazard in the dark. Sir Reginald waved her concerns away. Details, details. Now, let us prepare. Meet at the maze's eastern entrance at midnight sharp. As the guests dispersed to fetch cloaks and shawls, Eleanor followed Lady Amelia to the conservatory, where the air was humid with the scent of orchids. Are you quite all right, Lady Harrington? Eleanor asked gently, noting the older woman's pallor. Amelia forced a smile. Oh, Eleanor, you're too kind to notice. It's just, these gatherings always unsettle me. Reginald enjoys stirring things up, but I fear. She broke off, her eyes darting toward the door as if expecting an eavesdropper. Fear what? Eleanor prompted, her voice soft but insistent. Amelia hesitated, then shook her head. Nothing, just nerves. Let's join the others. The midnight hour arrived with a low rumble of thunder, and the guests assembled at the maze's eastern entrance, a stone archway draped with ivy. Lamps flickered along the path, casting pools of light that did little to dispel the maze's looming darkness. Sir Reginald stood at the forefront, a lantern in one hand and a folded paper in the other. The rules are simple, he announced. Within the maze, at the central pavilion, you'll find a locked box containing the sapphire brooch. The riddle on this paper, he waved it aloft, will guide you to the key. The first to unlock the box claims the prize. But beware, the maze is a cunning adversary, and time is short. You have 1 hour. He handed the riddle to Victor, who read it aloud with a strained voice. In shadows deep where secrets hide, seek the guardian who never lied. Beneath her gaze, the truth is near. Where moonlight falls, The key is clear." The words hung in the air, cryptic and ominous, as the guests exchanged puzzled glances. Without further ado, Sir Reginald led the way into the maze, his lantern bobbing like a willow. The wisp. The group followed, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth. Eleanor stayed close to Lady Amelia, whose breathing was shallow and quick. Victor and Clarissa moved as a pair, their whispers sharp and urgent. Lydia strode ahead, her notebook clutched tightly, while Forbes trailed behind, his cigarette glowing faintly. Reverend Hale and Mrs. Grantham walked together, their conversation a low hum of platitudes, and Dr. Croft, ever observant, kept pace with Eleanor, his medical bag slung over his shoulder. The maze was a world unto itself, its high yew walls closing in like the pages of a book, each turn revealing nothing but more green corridors. The air grew cooler, the scent of earth and foliage mingling with the faint tang of impending rain. Sir Reginald's laughter echoed ahead, guiding them deeper until they reached a fork where he paused. "Split up, if you dare," he called. "The pavilion is not far, but the key." "Ah, that's the challenge." The group hesitated, then fragmented. Victor and Clarissa took the left path, Lydia the right, and Forbes slipped away alone, his figure vanishing into the shadows. Reverend Hale and Mrs. Grantham chose a middle route, while Eleanor, Amelia, and Croft stayed with Sir Reginald, who seemed intent on reaching the pavilion first. At 12:15 a.m., a scream shattered the night, a high, piercing cry that froze Eleanor's blood. It came from the direction of the pavilion, and without a word, Sir Reginald quickened his pace, his lantern swinging wildly. Eleanor and Croft followed, supporting Amelia, who clutched Eleanor's arm in terror. They emerged into the central pavilion, a circular clearing dominated by a marble statue of Artemis, her bow drawn and her gaze fixed skyward. The locked box sat on a pedestal beneath her, untouched, but Sir Reginald was nowhere to be seen. "Reginald," Amelia cried, her voice breaking. "Where are you?" Croft scanned the pavilion, his face grim. "He was just ahead of us. He said he can't have gone far." Eleanor's eyes darted to the ground, where the lantern lay shattered, its flame extinguished. A faint smear of blood glistened on the pedestal's edge, stark against the pale stone. "Edmund," she whispered, pointing. "Look." Before Croft could respond, Victor and Clarissa burst into the clearing, their faces flushed. "What's happened?" Victor demanded. "We heard a scream." "It was me," Amelia admitted, trembling. "Reginald, he's gone." Lydia arrived next, her notebook forgotten in her hand. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" Her voice was sharp, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. Forbes emerged last, his cigarette discarded, his expression unreadable. "Has anyone checked the paths?" he asked coolly. Croft knelt by the pedestal, examining the blood. "This is fresh," he said. "And there's a scuff mark here. Someone fell, or was struck." The group searched the pavilion and nearby paths, calling Sir Reginald's name, but the maze swallowed their voices. At 12:30 a.m., Reverend Hale and Mrs. Grantham rejoined them, their faces pale. "We found nothing," Hale said, his voice unsteady, "but I heard a thud, just before the scream." By 12:45 a.m., the rain began to fall, a light drizzle that turned the earth to mud. Croft, ever practical, organized a systematic search, but the maze's twists confounded them. It was Mrs. Grantham who, at 1 a.m., stumbled upon the body. Sir Reginald Harrington lay sprawled in a dead-end alcove, not 50 yards from the pavilion. His skull was shattered, a jagged stone beside him stained with blood. His eyes stared blankly at the sky, and the riddle paper, crumpled and bloodied, was clutched in his hand. Amelia collapsed, sobbing, as Croft confirmed the obvious. "He's dead. Murdered, by the look of it." Victor swore under his breath, Clarissa's hand tightening on his arm. Lydia stood rigid, her face a mask. Forbes lit another cigarette, his hand steady but his eyes distant. Reverend Hale murmured a prayer, while Mrs. Grantham clutched her shawl, whispering, "Who could do such a thing?" Eleanor, her heart pounding, studied the scene. The stone, the blood, the crumpled paper, all pieces of a puzzle that felt both intimate and monstrous. She thought of St. Mary Mead, of the petty jealousies and hidden grudges that festered beneath. Polite smiles. This, she knew, was no different, just grander in scale. As the rain fell harder, washing away the edges of the crime, Eleanor realized that Thornwood Manor had become a labyrinth, not just of yew, but of lies, and somewhere, In the shadows of its paths, a killer lurked. Chapter 3. The arrival. The rain had settled into a steady patter by the time the authorities were summoned to Thornwood Manor, the drops drumming a mournful rhythm on the maze's yew walls. The guests, drenched and shaken, had retreated to the drawing-room, where a fire roared in a futile attempt to dispel the chill of Sir Reginald Harrington's murder. Eleanor Prescott sat near Lady Amelia, whose delicate frame trembled beneath a woolen blanket, her eyes red-rimmed but vacant, as if shock had drained her of expression. The other suspects, Victor, Clarissa, Lydia, Forbes, Reverend Hale, and Mrs. Grantham, clustered in uneasy silence, their faces a gallery of grief, suspicion, and guarded calculation. Dr. Edmund Croft, ever the pragmatist, had taken charge of preserving the scene until the police arrived, his medical bag open as he catalogued observations in a small notebook. The local constable, a stout man named P.C. Hargreaves, arrived at 2 a.m., his boots squelching on the manor's marble floors. He was accompanied by Inspector Clarence Reed from the Kent County Constabulary, a wiry man in his late 40s, with a hawkish face and eyes that seemed to dissect every detail. Reed's reputation for methodical precision preceded him, but Eleanor noted a flicker of unease as he surveyed the assembled Campania group, far above his usual purview of village squabbles. He took statements with brisk efficiency, noting the time of the scream 12:15 a.m., the discovery of the body 1 a.m., and the alibis of those present. Yet the maze, with its labyrinthine paths and rain-slicked clues, offered little clarity. The bloodied stone, the crumpled riddle paper, and the shattered lantern were collected as evidence. But the rain had blurred footprints and washed away subtler traces. By 3 a.m. the investigation had stalled, the inspector's questions growing repetitive as exhaustion set in. It was then that a soft knock at the manor's front door startled the room. A maid, her apron damp, admitted a small, unassuming figure wrapped in a sensible raincoat and a knitted shawl. Miss Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead stepped into the drawing-room, her silver hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat, her blue eyes, bright with quiet intelligence. In her hands she carried a wicker basket, as if she had merely popped by for tea, rather than to confront a murder. Miss Marple, Eleanor exclaimed, rising to greet her. However, did you know to come? Miss Marple's lips curved into a gentle smile, though her gaze swept the room with the precision of a hawk. My dear Eleanor, Dr. Croft was kind enough to telephone me from the village exchange. He mentioned a tragedy at Thornwood, and well, I thought I might be of some small assistance. I was staying with my nephew in Kent, you see, not far at all. Inspector Reed, who had been scribbling in his notebook, looked up with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Miss Marple, is it? I've heard of you. Something about a case in Chipping Cleghorn, wasn't it? Well, this is a police matter, but I suppose there's no harm in your presence, provided you don't interfere. Oh, I wouldn't dream of interfering, Inspector, Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but laced with an undercurrent of steel. I merely observe, you know. People are so very like one another, whether in St. Mary Mead or a grand place like this. Human nature, Inspector, is a most revealing study. She settled into an armchair near the fire, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she drew a ball of pale blue wool from her basket. The sound, gentle yet persistent, seemed to anchor the room's chaotic energy, and Eleanor felt a surge of relief. Miss Marple's unassuming presence was like a lantern in the fog, unobtrusive, yet capable of illuminating hidden truths. Inspector Reed resumed his inquiries, focusing on the timeline. According to your statements, he said, addressing the group, Sir Reginald entered the maze at midnight, followed by all of you. The scream was heard at 12:15 a.m., and the body was found at 1 a.m. by Mrs. Grantham. Can anyone account for their whereabouts between 12 o'clock and 12:15? Victor Harrington shifted uncomfortably, his mustache twitching. Clarissa and I took the left path, as I said. We were together the whole time, trying to decipher that blasted riddle. We didn't see father after the fork. Clarissa nodded, her eyes wide with practiced innocence. It's true, Inspector. The maze is so confusing, and the lamps were dim. We heard the scream and ran toward the pavilion, but we found nothing until we joined the others. Lydia Beaumont, seated stiffly on a settee, interjected, I took the right path alone, mapping the turns as I went. I heard the scream but was too far to reach the pavilion quickly. I saw no one until I rejoined the group. Desmond Forbes, leaning against the mantelpiece, exhaled a plume of cigarette smoke. I wandered off on my own. Inspector, I'm not one for games, but I thought I'd explore. I was near the western edge when I heard the scream. Took me a while to find my way back. Reverend Hale, his hands clasped tightly, spoke softly. Mrs. Grantham and I stayed together, taking the middle path. We heard the scream and a thud, but the maze is so disorienting. We found nothing until we reached the pavilion. Mrs. Grantham nodded vigorously. It was dreadful, Inspector N. Then to find poor Sir Reginald like that. I'll never forget it. Lady Amelia, her voice barely audible, murmured, I was with Eleanor and Dr. Croft, following Reginald. He was just ahead, but he vanished so quickly. I don't understand how. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for a fraction of a second, her eyes flicking toward Amelia. Dear me, she said mildly. How very distressing for you, Lady Harrington. It must have been quite a shock to lose sight of him so suddenly. The maze, I understand, is quite intricate. Oh yes, Lydia replied, her tone sharp. I've mapped it extensively. It's a masterpiece of design, but treacherous in the dark. Reginald was foolish to insist on this midnight nonsense. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. Foolish, perhaps, but Sir Reginald seemed a man fond of theatrics. I recall a gentleman in St. Mary Mead, Mr. Tompkins, who loved to stage elaborate treasure hunts. Always caused such a stir, and not always a pleasant one. Eleanor, watching, Miss Marple recognized the familiar tactica, gentle anecdotes, so easily dismissed, were a net cast wide to catch the smallest slip. The room's occupants, however, seemed too preoccupied with their own defenses to notice. Inspector Reed, growing impatient, turned to Croft. Dr. Croft, your medical opinion? Croft closed his notebook. The wound was caused by a single blow to the back of the head, likely with the stone found beside him. Death was instantaneous, around 12:15 a.m., based on the body's condition. The blood on the pedestal suggests he was struck there and dragged to the alcove. Miss Marple tilted her head. Dragged, you say? How curious. The stone was heavy, I presume. Quite, Croft replied. It would take some strength to wield it, or desperation, Miss Marple murmured, her needles resuming their rhythm. In my experience, desperation can lend strength to even the frailest soul. Like old Mrs. Carter, who lifted a cart to free her cat. Remarkable, what people can do when pressed. The inspector grunted, unconvinced, and dismissed the group to their rooms, warning them to remain on the premises. As the others filed out, Miss Marple beckoned Eleanor to her side. My dear, she whispered, you've been watching these people all evening. Tell me, what have you seen? Eleanor hesitated, then leaned closer. There's tension everywhere, Miss Victor resents his father's control. Clarissa seems ambitious. Lydia is possessive of the estate. And Forbes is too calm, too detached. Even Lady Amelia seems frightened of something beyond her husband's death. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Very good, Eleanor, you've a sharp eye. Now, I think I shall take a turn about the gardens tomorrow. Rain or no, mazes, you know, are like people. They hide their secrets in plain sight, if one knows where to look. As the fire crackled and the rain beat against the windows, Eleanor felt a shiver of anticipation. Miss Marple's arrival had shifted the air, like a key turning in a lock. The labyrinth of Thornwood Manor was no longer just a maze of you, it was a puzzle of human hearts, and Miss Marple was already unraveling its threads. Chapter 4. The questions begin. The rain had not relented by mid-morning. Its steady rhythm against Thornwood Manor's windows, a sombre accompaniment to the grim task of unraveling Sir Reginald Harrington's murder. The grand estate, with its polished floors and ancestral portraits, seemed to hold its breath, as if wary of revealing its secrets. Eleanor Prescott, still shaken by the events of the previous night, found herself drawn to the library, where Miss Jane Marple had taken up residence. The elderly spinster from St. Mary Mead sat in a high-backed chair near a roaring fire, her knitting needles moving with a calm precision that belied the chaos of the investigation. Her wicker basket rested at her feet, and a cup of tea, now cold, sat on the table beside her. Inspector Clarence Reed, his hawkish features etched with determination, had set up a makeshift headquarters in the manor study, where he pored over statements and evidence with P.C. Hargreaves. The bloodied stone, the crumpled riddle paper, and the shattered lantern were laid out on a table, each item a silent accusation. Yet the maze, with its rain-soaked paths, had yielded little else, and the inspector's frustration was palpable. He had declared his intention to interview each guest individually, hoping to catch a discrepancy in their alibis or unearth a motive strong enough to explain the brutal act. Miss Marple, however, preferred a less formal approach. As Eleanor joined her in the library, she found the older woman observing the household with her characteristic blend of serenity and sharpness. "Good morning, Eleanor," Miss Marple said, her blue eyes twinkling over the rim of her spectacles. "I trust you've been keeping your eyes open. People are so very revealing when they think no one is watching." Eleanor nodded, settling into a chair opposite. "I've tried, Miss Marple, but it's all so overwhelming. Everyone seems to have a reason to resent Sir Reginald, yet no one admits to anything." "Quite so," Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking softly. "Resentment is a common thread in human nature, my dear. Like Mrs. Baxter in St. Mary Mead, who held a grudge against her neighbour for years over a borrowed teapot. It's the small things, you see, that fester into something darker." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lady Amelia Harrington, who drifted into the library like a ghost, her lavender dressing gown trailing behind her. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with grief and something deeper "Perhaps, Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling. "Eleanor, I couldn't stay in my room any longer. The silence is unbearable." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her expression softening. "My dear Lady Harrington, you've had a terrible shock. Would you care to sit with us? A little company can do wonders." Amelia sank into a chair, her hands twisting in her lap. "I keep seeing him, lying there in the maze. Who could do such a thing? Reginald was difficult, but he didn't deserve this." Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze gentle but probing. "No one deserves such a fate, Lady Harrington. Tell me, did Sir Reginald seem himself yesterday? Any unusual behaviour? Perhaps?" Amelia hesitated, her fingers tightening. "He was agitated, more than usual. He kept talking about the will, hinting at changes. It upset Victor terribly, and Lydia wasn't pleased either. She's so attached to Thornwood, you know." Miss Marple nodded, as if filing the information away. "And you, my dear, how did you feel about these changes?" Amelia's eyes widened, a flush creeping into her cheeks. I didn't care about the money. I only wanted peace. Reginald's decisions always stirred trouble." Eleanor, watching closely, noted the tremor in Amelia's voice, the way her gaze darted toward the door. Miss Marple, too, seemed to notice, but her tone remained mild. "Peace is a rare commodity in a house like this. I recall a family in St. Mary Mead, the Hendersons, whose disputes over an inheritance caused such a rift. It's curious how money brings out the truth in people." Before Amelia could respond, Victor Harrington stormed into the library, his face flushed with anger. "This is intolerable," he declared, brandishing a letter. "Reed's hounding me about my debts, as if I'm the only one with motive. Father's will was a sword over all our heads." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes flicking to the letter. "Dear me, Mr. Harrington, you seem quite distressed. Perhaps you'd share what troubles you. It can be so clarifying to speak plainly." Victor hesitated, then slumped into a chair, the letter crumpling in his hand. "It's no secret, Father and I argued. He thought me a wastrel, but I only asked for what was fair. He was planning to cut me out, give everything to Amelia or some blasted charity, but I didn't kill him." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Of course, Mr. Harrington. And where were you when the scream was heard? You and Mrs. Harrington were together, I believe." "Yes," Victor said quickly. "Clarissa and I were on the left path, trying to solve that wretched riddle. We heard the scream and ran to the pavilion, but Father was already gone." Clarissa entered at that moment, her elegance undimmed, despite the strain in her eyes. "It's true, Miss Marple," she said, her voice smooth but guarded. "We were together the whole time. The maze was so dark, and the rain made it worse. We couldn't have seen anything." Miss Marple's smile was serene. How trying it must have been to recall a night in St. Mary Mead when the power failed during a storm. People stumbled about, claiming to be where they weren't. Darkness can be so revealing. Eleanor caught the subtle emphasis, her mind racing. Miss Marple's questions, so gentle, were like pebbles dropped into a still pond, their ripples exposing hidden currents. She followed Miss Marple's lead as they moved to the conservatory, where Lydia Beaumont was tending to a tray of orchids, her movements precise but tense. "Good morning, Miss Beaumont," Miss Marple said, peering at the flowers. "What a lovely collection. You must know every inch of this estate, including the maze." Lydia's lips tightened. "I do. I've studied it for years. Its design, its history. It's a work of art, not a place for murder." "Kichi, Miss Marple." "Agreed, yet someone used it for just that." "You were alone when the scream was heard, I understand." Lydia's eyes narrowed. "I was mapping the right path. I heard the scream but was too far to reach the pavilion quickly. I told Reed as much." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to a pair of pruning shears on the table. "Such precision in your work. It reminds me of a gardener in St. Mary Mead, who could tell a lie by the way a man held a trowel. Small things, you see, tell such stories." Lydia stiffened but said nothing, turning back to her orchids. As they left the conservatory, Miss Marple and Eleanor encountered Desmond Forbes on the terrace, smoking a cigarette and staring at the maze. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth as polished glass, "you seem to have a knack for asking questions. Found anything interesting?" "Only people, Mr. Forbes," she replied, her tone mild. "They're far more interesting than clues, like a certain shopkeeper in my village, who always knew more than he let on." "You were alone in the maze, I believe." Forbes exhaled a plume of smoke. "I was. I prefer my own company. Heard the scream. Found my way to the pavilion eventually. Nothing more to tell." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the cigarette, then returned to his face. "How very solitary. Yet even the solitary leave traces, don't they?" As they walked back to the library, Eleanor whispered, "You're teasing them all, Miss Marple. But what are you looking for?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "The truth, my dear, is like a knot in my knitting. You tug gently, and it unravels. These people are hiding something, perhaps not murder, but something. And in that something, we'll find our way." By noon, Miss Marple had spoken to Reverend Hale, who fidgeted nervously, and Mrs. Grantham, who prattled about village gossip. Each conversation, seemingly innocuous, was a probe into the household's undercurrents. Eleanor marveled at Miss Marple's skill. Her questions, like her knitting, wove a pattern only she could see, but one that promised to ensnare the guilty. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The morning after Sir Reginald Harrington's murder dawned grey and sodden, the rain having settled into a persistent drizzle that cloaked Thornwood Manor in a mournful veil. The estate, so vibrant during the previous day's fete, now seemed to sag under the weight of tragedy, its grandeur muted by the knowledge of death within its maze. Eleanor Prescott, having slept fitfully in a guest room, rose early to find the household in a state of uneasy quiet. Servants moved silently, their eyes averted, while the guests gathered in the breakfast room, their appetites subdued by the shadow of Inspector Reed's ongoing investigation. Miss Jane Marple, however, appeared undeterred by the gloom. She sat at a small table near the window, her knitting needles clicking with their usual rhythm, a cup of tea steaming beside her. Her presence, unassuming yet oddly commanding, drew Eleanor's attention as she entered the room. "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice as bright as the weather was. "Dear, I trust you slept, though I imagine none of us found much rest." Eleanor managed a small smile, settling across from her. "Not much, Miss Marple. The events of last night, they're hard to shake." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her eyes flicking toward the other guests. "Murder has a way of lingering, like damp in an old house, but it's often in the quiet moments, when people think themselves unobserved, that the truth begins to show itself." The breakfast room was sparsely populated. Victor Harrington sat alone at the far end, his face haggard as he pushed scrambled eggs around his plate. Clarissa, unusually subdued, sipped coffee nearby, her usual vivacity replaced by a strained composure. Lydia Beaumont was absent, reportedly in the greenhouse, while Desmond Forbes stood by the sideboard, methodically buttering toast. Lady Amelia remained in her room, attended by a maid, her nerves too fragile for company. Reverend Hale and Mrs. Grantham conversed in low tones near the fireplace, their expressions grave, while Dr. Edmund Croft, ever practical, reviewed his notes from the night before. Inspector Reed entered at 8:30 a.m., his hawkish features sharpened by a sleepless night. He carried a notebook and a small evidence bag containing the bloodied stone, which he placed on the table with a deliberate thud. "Good morning," he said curtly. "I've spoken with the coroner, and Sir Reginald's death is officially a homicide. The stone was the weapon, and the blow was struck with considerable force. I'll need to re-interview each of you today, starting with Mr. Victor Harrington." Victor's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "Me? Why single me out, Inspector?" Reed's expression remained impassive. "Your fingerprints were found on the riddle paper clutched in your father's hand. Care to explain?" A murmur rippled through the room, and Eleanor felt a prickle of unease. Victor's face reddened, his mustache twitching. "That's easy explained," he snapped. "Father handed me the paper to read aloud before we entered the maze. Of course, my prints are on it." "Perhaps," Reed said, his tone skeptical. "But you also stood to lose a great deal if Sir Reginald altered his will, as he hinted yesterday. And your alibi being with your wife in the mazes rather convenient, wouldn't you say?" Clarissa's cup clattered against its saucer. "Inspector, that's absurd. Victor and I were together the entire time. We heard the scream and ran to the pavilion, just as we said." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze resting on Clarissa with mild curiosity. "Dear me," she said, softly, "how very loyal. I recall a young couple in St. Mary Mead, always vouching for each other. Such devotion can be touching or quite the opposite, when secrets are involved." Victor shot her a sharp look but said nothing, his jaw tight. Reed, undeterred, pressed on. "There's also the matter of your financial troubles, Mr. Harrington. My inquiries reveal you've accrued significant debts in London, debts your father refused to cover." The room fell silent, the accusation hanging like a storm cloud. Victor rose, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is outrageous. I loved my father, despite our differences. I'd never harm him." Forbes, still by the sideboard, raised an eyebrow but remained silent, his toast forgotten. Reverend Hale cleared his throat, attempting to diffuse the tension. "Inspector, surely we must consider all possibilities. Sir Reginald had many associates, some less scrupulous than others." Mrs. Grantham nodded eagerly. "Quite right, Reverend. Why, I heard Sir Reginald arguing with Mr. Forbes just last week about some business matter, quite heated." It was Forbes's eyes flicked toward her, cool and unyielding. "Gossip, Mrs. Grantham, is a dangerous pastime. Sir Reginald and I had disagreements, as partners do, but nothing to warrant murder." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her voice gentle but probing. "Business disputes can be so very revealing. Mr. Forbes, in St. Mary Mead, I knew a grocer who quarrelled with his supplier over a few shillings. It seemed trivial, but oh, the motives it uncovered." Reed, growing impatient, turned to Forbes. "Care to elaborate on those disagreements?" Forbes shrugged, his composure merely a difference of opinion on investment strategies. "Sir Reginald favoured tradition. I preferred innovation, nothing more." Eleanor, watching closely, noted the slight tightening of Forbes's fingers around his niffer gesture, so fleeting, it might have gone unnoticed. Miss Marple, however, tilted her head, her eyes narrowing imperceptibly. The inspector's focus on Victor persisted throughout the morning, his questions circling like hawks. He produced a letter, found in Sir study, in which Victor had pleaded for funds to settle a gambling debt. "This suggests motive," Reed said, waving the letter. "An opportunity, given your presence in the maze." Victor's temper flared. Half the county was in that maze. "Inspector, why not question Lydia, who knows every twist of it, or twist of it? Forbes, who's been fleecing my father for years." Lydia, entering the room at that moment, bristled. "How dare you, Victor? My knowledge of the maze is academic, not criminal. If anyone had reason to resent Reginald, it was you, always grovelling for his money." The argument escalated until Reed called for order, his patience fraying. By noon, Victor was the prime suspect, his fingerprints, debts, and heated exchanges with his father forming a damning narrative. The other guests, relieved to be spared scrutiny, dispersed to their rooms or the library, their alibis unchallenged for now. Eleanor, lingering with Miss Marple, felt a growing unease. "Victor seems an obvious choice," she whispered, "but it feels too neat, doesn't it?" Miss Marple nodded, her knitting a steady counterpoint to the room's tension. "Far too neat, my dear. In my experience, the obvious culprit is rarely the true one. Like poor Mr. Jenkins in St. Mary Mead, accused of stealing because he was seen near the vicarage. It was the vicar's nephew all along. You see, with a much cleverer motive. They moved to the conservatory, where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and orchids." Miss Marple paused by a window overlooking the maze, its yew walls glistening in the rain. "This maze," she mused, is like a mind, Eleanor, full of twists and dead ends, but with a path to the truth, if one treads carefully. Tell me, did you notice anything odd last night, beyond the scream and the blood? Eleanor frowned, recalling the chaotic moments in the pavilion. There was the shattered lantern, of course, and the blood on the pedestal. But there was something else. Clarissa's shawlet was caught on a yew branch near the pavilion, but she didn't mention it, and Forbes's cigarette he discarded it so quickly when he arrived, as if he didn't want it seen. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Very good, Eleanor. Small things, but they matter. A shawl, a cigarette, a hurried step, these are the threads of a tapestry. We must weave them carefully. As the afternoon wore on, Reed summoned Victor for a formal interview in the library, his tone suggesting an arrest was imminent. The household buzzed with whispers, the consensus forming that Victor, driven by debt and resentment, had struck his father in a fit of rage. Yet Eleanor, guided by Miss Marple's quiet wisdom, sensed the truth lay elsewhere, buried in the maze's shadows and the secrets of its wanderers. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her serene expression belying the sharpness of her mind. Patience, my dear, she murmured. The red herrings are plentiful, but the truth, like a good stitch, will hold fast when pulled. Chapter 6. A clue in detail. The drizzle had softened to a fine mist by the afternoon of Sir Reginald Harrington's murder, casting Thornwood Manor in a silvery haze that seemed to blur the edges of reality. The household remained under a pall, the guests confined to the estate by Inspector Reed's orders, their movements shadowed by suspicion. Eleanor Prescott, her nerves taut from the morning's tense exchanges, found solace in Miss Jane Marple's quiet company. The elderly spinster sat in the library, her knitting needles moving with their familiar cadence, a pale blue scarf taking shape in her hands. Yet her eyes, bright and piercing, missed nothing, darting from the rain-streaked windows to the faces of those who passed through the room. Eleanor, my dear, Miss Marple said, her voice soft as she glanced up from her work. Would you care to take a turn with me through the gardens? The air, however damp, might clear our thoughts. Eleanor, grateful for the distraction, agreed, and the two women donned their coats and stepped into the mist. The maze loomed in the distance, its yew walls dark and forbidding, but Miss Marple steered them toward the formal gardens, where roses drooped under the weight of raindrops. A garden, she mused, is so like a village. Everything seems orderly, but beneath the surface there's such a tangle of roots. They paused near a stone bench, where Miss Marple's gaze settled on a small, overlooked detail, a single cigarette stub, half buried in the gravel, its paper stained but intact. She bent down, her movements slow but deliberate, and retrieved it with a handkerchief. Now, isn't that curious? She said, holding it up to the dim light. Mr. Forbes is fond of his cigarettes, is he not? Yet this one is a different brand, French, I believe, with a gold tip, not as usual if I recall. Eleanor frowned, her mind racing back to the night of the murder. Forbes was smoking in the maze, but he discarded his cigarette quickly when he joined us at the pavilion. Do you think this means something? Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. Everything means something, my dear, if you look closely enough, like Mrs. Phipps in St. Mary Mead, who left a hairpin at the scene of a theft. It wasn't the theft that mattered, but what the hairpin told us about her movements. They continued their walk, circling closer to the maze's eastern entrance, where the police had cordoned off the path to the pavilion. Inspector Reed, emerging from the manor with P.C. Hargreaves, spotted them and approached, his expression a mix of irritation and curiosity. Miss Marple, he said, I hope you're not tampering with my crime scene. Oh heavens no, Inspector, she replied, her tone mild, merely stretching my legs. Though I did find this. She held out the cigarette stub, wrapped in her handkerchief. It was near the bench, just there. Perhaps one of your men dropped it. Reed's eyes narrowed as he took the stub, examining it closely. French gold-tipped, not common around. Here, I'll have it checked, but it's likely nothing. He pocketed it, his skepticism clear. But Miss Marple's serene nod suggested she thought otherwise. Back in the library, the household was abuzz with Reed's latest focus on Victor Harrington, whose fingerprints on the riddle paper and financial troubles made him the prime suspect. Yet Miss Marple, settling into her chair, seemed more interested in the smaller details of the night. Eleanor, she said, let us revisit the moment of the scream. You were with Lady Amelia and Dr. Croft, just behind Sir Reginald. What exactly did you see? Eleanor closed her eyes, summoning the memory. It was dark, and the lamps were flickering. Sir Reginald was ahead, his lantern bobbing. Then he turned a corner, and we lost sight of him. Amelia screamed, and we ran to the pavilion. The lantern was shattered, and there was blood on the pedestal. But there was something else. A sound, like a rustle, just before the scream. I thought it was the wind, but now I'm not sure. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze sharpening. A rustle, you say? How very interesting. And the blood on the pedestal, did it seem fresh, or had it begun to dry? Fresh, Eleanor replied, recalling the vivid red smear. It glistened, in the lamplight, as if it had just been spilled. Curious, Miss Marple murmured. Blood dries quickly, you know, especially in the damp air. If Sir Reginald was struck at 12:15, as Dr. Croft estimates, and he reached the pavilion moments later, the blood should have been fresh, yet the body was found later, in an alcove. It suggests movement. Eleanor's heart quickened. You mean the killer moved him? But why? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Why, indeed. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a man who moved a broken vase to hide a theft. The act of moving it told us more than the theft itself. We must consider what the killer hoped to conceal or reveal. Their conversation was interrupted by Clarissa Harrington, who entered the library with a forced smile, her silk dress rustling as she approached. Miss Marple, Eleanor, you're always tucked away together, plotting to solve the mystery, are you? Oh, hardly plotting, Miss Marple said, her tone disarming. Merely chatting. I was just admiring your shawl last night, Mrs. Harrington. Such a lovely shade of green. It caught on a yew branch, I believe. Clarissa's smile faltered, her hand touching her neck as if remembering the shawl. Oh yes, it did. The maze is so overgrown. I tore it free and didn't think much of it. Of course, Miss Marple said, her needles resuming their rhythm. Though it's odd, isn't it, how a shawl can catch so easily, yet be torn free without a sound. I recall a young lady in St. Mary Mead whose scarf caught on a gate, and the noise it made quite startling. Clarissa's eyes flickered with unease, but she recovered quickly. I suppose I was too flustered to notice. If you'll excuse me, I must check on Victor. She swept out, leaving a faint scent of jasmine in her wake. Eleanor leaned closer to Miss Marple. You're suspicious of her, aren't you? Not suspicious, my dear, Miss Marple corrected gently. Curious. The shawl, the cigarette, the rustle, these are small inconsistencies, like dropped stitches. They don't yet form a pattern, but they will. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple requested a map of the maze from Lydia Beaumont, who provided it reluctantly, her scholarly pride warring with her defensiveness. The map, meticulously drawn, showed every twist and dead end, with the pavilion at its heart. Miss Marple studied it, her finger tracing the path from the eastern entrance to the alcove where Sir Reginald's body was found. This alcove, she said, is quite close to the pavilion, yet hidden, a perfect place to linger. Eleanor nodded, her mind turning to the bloodied stone. The stone was heavy. Miss Marple, could someone like Clarissa, or even Amelia, have wielded it? Strength comes in many forms, Miss Marple replied. Anger, fear, desperation. They can make the impossible possible, like Mrs. Carter, in my village, who lifted a cart to save her cat. We must look beyond the physical to the heart of the matter. As the day waned, Inspector Reed summoned the household for another round of questions, his focus still on Victor. But Eleanor, guided by Miss Marple's subtle probes, began to see the maze not as a place, but as a mirror, reflecting the hidden motives of those who wandered its paths. The cigarette stub, the torn shawl, the rustle in the dark, these were clues, small but sharp, that pointed to a truth waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 7. More lies surfaced the second day at Thornwood Manor, unfolded under a sky heavy with clouds, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and unspoken truths. The relentless drizzle had given way to a brooding stillness, as if the estate itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next revelation. Eleanor Prescott, her mind a whirl of Miss Marple's subtle observations, felt the weight of the murder pressing ever closer. The library, where she and Miss Marple had taken refuge, was a haven of quiet amidst the storm of suspicion that gripped the household. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles moving with their ceaseless rhythm, the pale blue scarf growing longer as her eyes scanned the room with quiet intensity. Inspector Reed's investigation had intensified, his focus still locked on Victor Harrington, whose fingerprints on the riddle paper and financial woes painted him as the prime suspect. Yet the household buzzed with whispers of other motives, like threads fraying from a tightly woven tapestry. Eleanor, having spent the morning observing the guests, sensed that the surface of civility was cracking, revealing glimpses of hidden affairs, financial desperation, and bitter feuds. As noon approached, Miss Marple suggested a walk to the greenhouse, where Lydia Beaumont was known to spend her hours. "Plants, my dear," Miss Marple said, rising with a sprightliness that belied her age, "are much like people. They thrive on care, but neglect or poison can wither them. I suspect Miss Beaumont's greenhouse may tell us something." The greenhouse, a glass-domed structure at the edge of the formal gardens, was a humid sanctuary of exotic blooms and tangled vines. Lydia stood at a workbench, her hands deftly repotting an orchid, her tweed suit immaculate despite the earthy task. She glanced up as Miss Marple and Eleanor entered, her expression guarded. "Miss Marple, Miss Prescott," she said, her voice crisp. "I hope you're not here to accuse me of neglecting my duties. The orchids require constant attention." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. "I've always admired a gardener's dedication. In St. Mary Mead, old Mr. Grayson tended his roses with such care, but he was terribly upset when someone trampled them. It's curious, isn't it, how a garden can reveal so much about its keeper?" Lydia's hands stilled, her eyes narrowing. "What are you implying?" "Nothing at all," Miss Marple said, peering at a cluster of ferns. "Though I did wonder about your attachment to Thornwood. Sir Reginald's talk of altering his will must have been unsettling, especially for someone so devoted to this estate." Lydia's jaw tightened, but she resumed her work. "Reginald was reckless with his plans. Thornwood is a legacy, not a toy to be tossed about. I told him as much, but he never listened." Eleanor, standing near a tray of gardening tools, noticed a small pair of pruning shears, their blades gleaming despite a faint stain on the handle. "Miss Beaumont," she ventured, "did you use these shears in the maze recently?" The ewes looked freshly trimmed near the pavilion. Lydia's gaze snapped to the shears, her composure faltering. "For a moment, I trimmed the maze regularly," she said curtly. "It's part of my work. If you're suggesting I use them for anything else, you're mistaken." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but she said nothing, merely nodding as if satisfied. As they left the greenhouse, she murmured to Eleanor, "A stain on a tool can be so telling, my dear, like the time Mrs. Harrow's kitchen knife was found with jam instead of butter. It led to quite a discovery." Their next encounter came unexpectedly. In the drawing room, where Clarissa Harrington sat alone, her elegant fingers toying with a strand of pearls, her face, usually a mask of charm, was drawn, and her eyes darted nervously as Miss Marple and Eleanor approached. "Mrs. Harrington," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair, "you look troubled. I do hope you're managing under such trying circumstances." Clarissa forced a smile, though it wavered. "It's dreadful, Miss Marple. Victor's being hounded by that inspector, and I can't bear the suspicion." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Suspicion is a heavy burden. I recall a young woman in St. Mary Mead, accused of stealing because she was seen near the church poor box. It wasn't theft, you see, but a secret she was keeping for another. Have you any secrets, Mrs. Harrington?" Clarissa's hand froze on her pearls, her breath catching. "Secrets? I don't know what you mean. Victor and I have nothing to hide." "Yet your shawl was caught in the maze," Miss Marple said gently, "and you were so quick to vouch for Victor's whereabouts. Loyalty is admirable, but it can sometimes obscure the truth." Before Clarissa could respond, Desmond Forbes entered, his silver hair catching the light as he lit a cigarette. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth, "you seem to have a knack for unsettling people. Care to try your questions on me?" Miss Marple smiled, unfazed. "Oh, Mr. Forbes, I'm merely an old woman who notices things. Like that cigarette you discarded in the maze French, wasn't it? So different from your usual brand." Forbes's eyes narrowed, but his smile remained. "A gift from a colleague. I smoke what's at hand. Surely you don't think a cigarette solves a murder?" "Not alone," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "But small things add up. Like Mr. Thompson in my village, who left a cigar stub where he shouldn't have. It led to quite a revelation about his late-night wanderings." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hall. Inspector Reed stormed in, followed by a pale-faced Victor and a tearful Lady Amelia. "We've found something," Reed announced, holding up a small leather notebook. It was hidden in Sir Reginald's desk, and it details financial irregularities in the Harrington-Forbes partnership. "Mr. Forbes, care to explain why Sir Reginald suspected you of embezzlement?" Forbes's composure cracked, his cigarette trembling slightly. "That's preposterous. Reginald and I had disagreements, but I never stole from him. That notebook is slander." Victor seized the moment, his voice rising. "Slander. You've been bleeding the estate dry for years, Forbes. Father knew it, and that's why he was going to cut you out." Amelia, wringing her hands, interjected, "Please, stop." Reginald was upset about the accounts, but he didn't believe it was Desmond. He thought it was someone closer. The room fell silent, the accusation hanging like a storm cloud. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm, but her eyes were sharp, taking in every reaction. Eleanor, watching closely, noted Clarissa's sudden pallor, Lydia's clenched fists, and Forbes's calculated stillness. "Someone closer," Miss Marple repeated softly. "How very illuminating. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a family where the closest ties hid the deepest betrayals. A brother, a sister, a spouse. Proximity breeds opportunity, doesn't it?" Reed, growing impatient, dismissed the group, but kept Forbes for further questioning. As the others dispersed, Eleanor whispered to Miss Marple, "The notebook changes everything. If Forbes was embezzling, he had a motive. But Amelia's words, they point to someone in the family." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind clearly racing. "Indeed, my dear, lies are surfacing, like weeds in a garden. The notebook, the shears, the shawl, the cigarette, they're all roots leading to the same dark soil. We must dig a little deeper." As the afternoon faded, the household buzzed with new tensions, financial deceit, family betrayals, and hidden loyalties. Eleanor felt the maze's shadow looming larger, its paths a metaphor for the tangled motives of those within. Miss Marple, however, remained a beacon of calm, her quiet observations peeling back layers of deception, one delicate thread at a time. Chapter 8. The emotional turning point. The atmosphere at Thornwood Manor had grown brittle by the late afternoon of the second day, as if the very walls were straining under the weight of secrets unearthed. The drizzle had ceased, leaving a damp chill that seeped into the bones, and the household moved with the cautious tread of those expecting an ambush. Eleanor Prescott, her nerves frayed by the mounting revelations, found herself drawn once more to Miss Jane Marple, whose serene presence in the library offered a rare anchor amidst the storm. The elderly spinster sat by the fire, her knitting, needles clicking with their familiar rhythm, a pale blue scarf now nearly complete, yet her eyes, sharp and unyielding, betrayed the intensity of her thoughts. The morning's discovery of Sir Reginald's notebook, hinting at financial irregularities, and casting suspicion on Desmond Forbes, had sent ripples of discord through the household. Victor Harrington, still reeling from Inspector Reed's accusations, had retreated to the billiard room, his temper flaring at anyone who approached. Clarissa, his wife, maintained her polished facade but seemed increasingly brittle, her laughter replaced by nervous glances. Lydia Beaumont, ensconced in her greenhouse, had grown more guarded, her scholarly demeanour a shield against prying questions. Lady Amelia, fragile as ever, remained in her room, attended by a maid, while Forbes, cool and enigmatic, deflected Reed's probes with calculated ease. Reverend Hale and Mrs. Grantham, the peripheral guests, hovered like anxious spectators, their whispers adding to the estate's tension. Miss Marple, however, seemed to sense that the case was nearing a turning point. "Eleanor, my dear," she said, setting her knitting aside, "emotions are like tea leaves, stir them, and the truth begins to settle. I think it's time we had a little chat with Lady Amelia. She's been so quiet, but grief often hides more than it reveals." Eleanor nodded, her heart quickening. "She's been so fragile." "Miss Marple, do you think she knows something?" "Knows, or fears," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but firm. "In St. Mary Mead, I knew a widow who kept silent about her husband's death, not out of guilt, but terror. We must tread softly." They found Lady Amelia in her private sitting room, a small, elegant space adorned with delicate watercolours and a chaise longue where she reclined, a damp handkerchief clutched in her hand. Her lavender dressing gown seemed to swallow her slight frame, and her eyes, red-rimmed from crying, widened at their entrance. "Miss Marple, Eleanor," she said, her voice a whisper. I wasn't expecting visitors." "Forgive the intrusion, Lady Harrington," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair with the ease of an invited guest. "I thought you might need a moment of company. Grief can be so isolating, can't it?" Amelia's lips trembled, and she nodded, her fingers twisting the handkerchief. "It's unbearable. Reginald was difficult, but I loved him. To think someone hated him enough, too." Her voice broke, and tears spilled down her cheeks. Miss Marple leaned forward, her expression one of infinite kindness. "My dear, you've borne so much. I wonder, though, if there's something weighing on you you've not told the inspector. In my village, I knew a lady who kept a secret to protect someone she cared for. It nearly broke her heart." Amelia's breath hitched, and for a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Then, as if a dam had burst, she began to speak, her words tumbling out in a rush. "It's Lydia," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She was so angry with Reginald. He wanted to sell part of the estate to fund a new venture with Desmond. Lydia said it would ruin Thornwood, that it was her life's work. They argued terribly the day before the fete. I heard her say, she said she'd stop him, no matter what. Eleanor's heart pounded, her mind flashing to Lydia's fierce attachment to the estate, her meticulous maps of the maze, the stained pruning shears in the greenhouse. "Did you tell Inspector Reed?" she asked gently. Amelia shook her head, tears falling faster. "I couldn't. She's my sister. But I'm so afraid. What if she—" She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Miss Marple reached out, patting Amelia's hand with a tenderness that belied her probing intent. There, my dear. You've done right to tell us. Secrets kept too long can fester, like a wound. But tell me, did you see Lydia in the maze that night?" Amelia hesitated, her eyes darting to the door, as if expecting an eavesdropper. I'm not sure. It was so dark, and Reginald was ahead of us. But I thought I saw someone near the pavilion, just before the screamer shadow, moving quickly. It could have been Lydia, or anyone." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind clearly racing. A shadow in the dark is so very like a doubt in the mind, isn't it? Hard to pin down, but impossible to ignore. "Thank you, Lady Harrington. You've been most helpful." As they left Amelia's room, Eleanor whispered, "Lydia's motive seemed strong, Miss Marple. The estate is her world. Could she have done it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but her voice was cautious. "Motive is not proof, my dear. Like Mrs. Harrow in St. Mary Mead, who threatened to poison her neighbour over a rose garden dispute. It was all bluster. Her real crime was a lesser one. We must look closer." Their next encounter came in the drawing room, where Victor and Clarissa were engaged in a heated, whispered argument. As Miss Marple and Eleanor entered, the couple fell silent, their faces masks of forced composure. "Miss Marple," Clarissa said, her smile tight, "you're everywhere today. Any progress in your little inquiries?" "Oh, I'm just an old woman who listens," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair. "But I do find it curious, Mrs. Harrington, how loyalties shift in a crisis. You and Mr. Harrington are so devoted, yet I wonder if there's more to your time in the maze than you've shared." Victor's face reddened. "See here, Miss Marple, I've had enough of instinct. Clarissa and I were together, and that's that. If you want a culprit, look at Forbes, he's the one with dirty hands." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Dirty hands are so often a matter of perspective. In St. Mary Mead, a young man was accused of theft because his hands were stained with ink. It turned out he'd been writing love letters, not stealing. Motives, you see, can be misread. Before Victor could retort, Desmond Forbes entered, his silver hair gleaming in the lamplight. "Trouble brewing," Victor Hay said coolly, lighting a cigarette. "Or are you just shouting to drown out your own guilt?" The room crackled with tension, and Eleanor felt the weight of Amelia's confession pressing against the accusations flying between the men. Miss Marple, however, remained unruffled, her gaze flitting from one to another. "Gentlemen," she said, "anger is such a revealing emotion. It's like a crack in a teacup small, but it shows where the pressure lies." As the afternoon waned, Inspector Reed summoned the household to the study, his expression grim. "I've had the notebook analyzed," he announced. "Sir Reginald's notes suggest not only embezzlement by Forbes, but also a secret loan Victor took from the estate's funds without his father's knowledge." Victor paled, while Forbes's eyes narrowed. Clarissa gasped, and Lydia, who had just joined them, clutched her notebook tightly. Amelia, standing in the doorway, looked as if she might faint. The room erupted in accusations, each voice louder than the last, until Reed called for silence. Miss Marple, watching quietly, murmured to Eleanor, "The truth is breaking through, my dear, like sunlight through clouds, but we must be careful. Some truths are meant to distract from others." Eleanor nodded, her mind reeling. Lydia's anger, Victor's loan, Forbes's embezzlement. Each revelation was a thread in the maze, leading closer to the heart of the crime. Yet Miss Marple's calm certainty suggested that the real truth, the one that would unravel the labyrinth, was still just out of reach. Chapter 9. The trap. The evening of the second day at Thornwood Manor descended with a heavy stillness, the clouds parting to reveal a pale moon that cast an eerie glow over the estate. The maze, its yew walls glistening from the earlier rain, stood as a silent sentinel, guarding the secrets of Sir Reginald Harrington's murder. Inside the manor, the atmosphere was taut, the guests' nerves frayed by the relentless probing of Inspector Reed and the quiet, incisive observations of Miss Jane Marple. Eleanor Prescott, her mind a tangle of clues and suspicions, felt the weight of the investigation pressing ever closer to a breaking point. The library, where Miss Marple had once again taken up her knitting, was a haven of calm amidst the storm, but Eleanor sensed that calm was about to be shattered. Miss Marple, her needles clicking with their familiar rhythm, looked up as Eleanor entered, her blue eyes bright with purpose. "Eleanor, my dear," she said, her voice soft but resolute, "I believe the time has come to gather our little circle. People, you see, reveal themselves most when they're pressed, like apples in a cider press. A gentle squeeze, and the truth flows out." Eleanor's heart quickened. "You mean to confront them, all of them?" Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene but steely. "Not confront, my dear. Nudge. In St. Mary Mead, I once resolved a theft by inviting the suspects to tea, a little conversation, a few questions, and the guilty party unraveled like a poorly knit scarf. We shall do something similar tonight." With Inspector Reed's reluctant approval, Miss Marple arranged for the household to gather in the drawing room at 8 p.m. The inspector, though skeptical of her methods, was growing frustrated with the lack of definitive evidence, and Victor Harrington's fingerprints and debts were not yet enough for an arrest. The room was prepared with care chairs arranged in a semicircle, the fire stoked to a warm glow, and a tea tray set out, its delicate cups a stark contrast to the gravity of the occasion. Miss Marple, in her unassuming grey dress and shawl, took her place near the fire, her knitting basket at her feet, while Eleanor stood nearby, ready to observe. The guests filed in, their faces a gallery of apprehension and defiance. Victor Harrington, his moustache twitching, sat stiffly beside Clarissa, whose elegant composure masked a nervous energy. Lydia Beaumont, clutching her notebook, took a seat near the window, her expression guarded. Desmond Forbes leaned against the mantelpiece, a cigarette unlit between his fingers, his eyes cool and calculating. Lady Amelia, pale and trembling, was supported by Dr. Edmund Croft, whose medical bag rested at his side. Reverend Hale and Mrs. Grantham, the peripheral figures, sat together, their unease palpable. Inspector Reed stood by the door, his notebook open, watching Miss Marple with a mix of curiosity and impatience. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle, but carrying an authority that silenced the room. "I know this has been a trying time, with poor Sir Reginald's death casting such a shadow, but I believe, with a little discussion, we might shed light on what happened in the maze that night." Victor snorted, his temper barely contained. "Discussion? Reed's been hounding me for days, and now you want to play parlor games. I've said all I'm going to say." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, undeterred. "Patience, Mr. Harrington. In St. Mary Mead, I found that a conversation can reveal what questions alone cannot. Let us start with the maze itself. Miss Beaumont, you know it so well perhaps. You could tell us about the alcove where Sir Reginald was found." Lydia's fingers tightened on her notebook. "It's a dead end, near the pavilion," she said curtly, "hidden by a curve in the mapped it thoroughly. Anyone could have stumbled upon it." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her needles pausing, "and yet someone chose it deliberately to hide the body. Curious, don't you think, that Sir Reginald was struck at the pavilion, where blood was found, but moved to the alcove? It suggests a plan, not a moment of passion." Clarissa shifted uncomfortably, her pearls clicking softly. "What are you implying, Miss Marple? That one of us planned this horror?" "Not implying. Mrs. Harrington, Miss Marple replied, her tone mild, merely observing. Your shawl, for instance, caught on a yew branch near the pavilion. A small thing, but it places you there, perhaps closer to the moment of the crime than you've admitted. Clarissa's face paled, her hand flying to her throat. I told you, it caught as we ran to the scream. Victor was with me. Victor nodded vigorously, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. Miss Marple turned to Forbes, who had lit his cigarette, the gold-tipped French brand glowing faintly. And you, Mr. Forbes, were alone in the maze, were you not? A cigarette stub, like the one you're smoking now, was found near the bench, yet you claim to have been on the western edge when the scream was heard. Forbes exhaled a plume of smoke, his smile thin. I smoke many brands, Miss Marple, and I was wandering, as I said. The maze is disorienting. You're making mountains out of molehills. Miss Marple's smile was serene. Perhaps, but molehills can hide tunnels, Mr. Forbes, like Mr. Thompson in my village, whose cigar stubs led us to his true whereabouts. Small things, you see, are so very telling. She turned to Lady Amelia, whose hands trembled in her lap. Lady Harrington, you mentioned a shadow in the maze, just before the scream. Could it have been someone you recognized, someone close? Perhaps. Amelia's breath caught, her eyes darting to Lydia, then away. I don't know, it was so dark. I thought it might have been Lydia, but I can't be sure. Lydia's face flushed with anger. Amelia, how dare you suggest such a thing? I was mapping the right path, nowhere near the pavilion. Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice soothing but firm. Now, let us not quarrel. The truth often emerges in moments of discomfort. Dr. Croft, you were with Lady Amelia and Eleanor. Did you notice anything unusual before the scream? Croft frowned, his boyish face serious. There was a rustle, just as Eleanor mentioned. I thought it was the wind, but it came from the yews, near the pavilion, and the blood on the pedestal was fresh, as if the blow had just been struck. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. Fresh blood, a rustle, a shawl, a cigarette, a shadow. These are the pieces of our puzzle. And then there's the notebook, suggesting financial deceit. Mr. Forbes, Mr. Harrington, both of you had reasons to fear Sir Reginald's scrutiny, but so, perhaps, did others. The room grew tense, the guests exchanging wary glances. Miss Marple's voice softened, but her words carried a quiet force. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a family torn apart by greed and fear. They hid their truths behind smiles, but pressure revealed them. I wonder, who among you is hiding the most? Victor leapt to his feet, his voice shaking. This is absurd. You're accusing us all, stirring up trouble with your village tales. Miss Marple remained unruffled, her needles resuming their rhythm. Not accusing, Mr. Harrington, merely asking. The maze, you see, is like a mine full of twists and secrets. But every maze has a center, and we are very close to it. As the fire crackled and the moon cast its pale light through the windows, Eleanor felt the trap closing not with force, but with the gentle, relentless pressure of Miss Marple's words. The guilty, she knew, were beginning to squirm, and the truth was only a breath away from breaking free. Chapter 10. The reveal. The drawing-room of Thornwood Manor was a crucible of tension as the clock struck 9 on the second evening. The fire's glow, casting flickering shadows across the faces of the assembled guests. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the hearth with her knitting basket at her side, commanded the room with an authority that belied her unassuming appearance. Her pale blue scarf lay completed across her lap, a symbol of the threads she had woven together over the past 2 days. Eleanor Prescott, standing close, felt her heart pound as Miss Marple prepared to unravel the mystery of Sir Reginald Harrington's murder. Inspector Reed, his notebook open, stood by the door, his skepticism tempered by a grudging respect for the elderly spinster's insight. The suspects Victor, Clarissa, Lydia, Forbes, Lady Amelia, Reverend Hale, and Mrs. Grantham sat in a tense semicircle, their eyes darting between Miss Marple and one another. "Thank you all for indulging an old woman's desire to talk," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but carrying a weight that silenced the room. "Murder is a dreadful thing, and Sir Reginald's death has left us all shaken. But the truth, like a well-tended garden, must be uncovered carefully, lest we trample the roots." Victor Harrington shifted impatiently, his moustache twitching. "Get on with it, Miss Marple. You've been poking about with your questions for days. If you know something, say it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but her expression remained serene. "Patience, Mr. Harrington. In St. Mary Mead, I learned that haste obscures truth. Let us walk through the maze of that night, step by step, and see where it leads." She leaned forward, her hands folded over her scarf. Sir Reginald was struck at the pavilion at 12:15 a.m., as Dr. Croft's examination confirmed. The blood on the pedestal was fresh, the lantern shattered, and the riddle paper crumpled in his hand. Yet his body was found in an alcove, a short distance away. This suggests the killer acted quickly, striking in the pavilion and moving the body to conceal it. Why? To delay discovery, perhaps, or to mislead us. Inspector Reed nodded, his pen poised. "Go on, Miss Marple. You've got my attention." Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, lingering on each face. "Let us consider the clues. A cigarette stub, French and gold-tipped, found near the bench knot, Mr. Forbes's usual brand, though he claimed it was a gift. A shawl, caught on a yew-branch near the pavilion, belonging to Mrs. Harrington, who insists it tore as she ran. A rustle in the dark, heard by Eleanor and Dr. Croft, just before the scream. And a pair of pruning shears in the greenhouse, stained not with sap, but with something darker." Lydia Beaumont's fingers tightened on her notebook, her face palling. "Those shears are for gardening," she said sharply. "You can't seriously suggest—" "I suggest nothing yet," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "I merely observed, like Mrs. Harrow in St. Mary Mead, whose kitchen knife held traces of something other than butter. Small things, you see, tell large stories." She turned to Lady Amelia, whose hands trembled in her lap. "Lady Harrington, you saw a shadow in the maze, just before the scream. You feared it was your sister, but you couldn't be sure. And you told us of Lydia's anger over Sir Reginald's plan to sell part of the estate, a plan that threatened her life's work." Amelia's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the floor. Lydia's voice rose, indignant. "Amelia, how could you? I loved Thornwood, yes, but I'd never kill for it." Miss Marple raised a hand, her tone soothing. "Let us not leap to conclusions. There's also the notebook, revealing financial irregularities. Mr. Forbes, Sir Reginald suspected you of embezzlement, did he not?" Desmond Forbes, his cigarette unlit, met her gaze with cool defiance. "He suspected many things, Miss Marple, but I'm no thief, and certainly no murderer. And you, Mr. Harrington," Miss Marple continued, turning to Victor, "stood to lose your inheritance. Your debts were mounting, and Sir Reginald's threats to alter his will were a blow. You and Mrs. Harrington claim to have been together, yet the shawl suggests Mrs. Harrington was closer to the pavilion than you've admitted." Clarissa's face flushed, her pearls clicking as she gripped them. "I told you, it caught as we ran. Victor was with me." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. "So you say, but let us consider the sequence. Sir Reginald entered the maze at midnight, leading the way. The scream came at 12:15, and the body was found at 1 o'clock. The killer needed opportunity to the pavilion, knowledge of the maze, and a moment alone with Sir Reginald." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "The rustle in the dark is key. It suggests someone was already at the pavilion, waiting. Not Victor, who was untrusted with reading the riddle aloud, nor Clarissa, whose shawl caught later, not Forbes, whose cigarette was found elsewhere, not Amelia, who was with Eleanor and Dr. Croft, but Miss Beaumont. You were alone, mapping the right path, yet you know the maze better than anyone. You could have reached the pavilion quickly, unseen." Lydia's face contorted with fury. "This is outrageous. I was nowhere near the pavilion." Miss Marple's voice remained calm, yet the pruning shears, stained with blood, suggest otherwise. "I sent them to Inspector Reed this afternoon for analysis, and the results confirm it human blood, matching Sir Reginald's and your notebook. Miss Beaumont contains not just maps, but a sketch of the pavilion, with a note, 'Must stop him.'" The room gasped, all eyes turning to Lydia. She leaped to her feet, her notebook falling to the floor. "That's not what it means. I meant stop his plans, not kill him." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. "I believe you, Miss Beaumont, about your intentions, but the truth is clearer now. You argued with Sir Reginald in the maze, didn't you? You followed him, knowing his route from your maps. You confronted him at the pavilion, and in a moment of rage, perhaps not premeditated, you struck him with the shears you carried for trimming. The stone was a later addition, to mislead us." Lydia's face crumpled, her defiance giving way to anguish. "I didn't mean to. I only wanted to talk, to make him see reason. He laughed at me, said Thornwood was just land, not my life. I lashed out. I didn't realize." She sank back into her chair, sobbing. Amelia cried out, reaching Hawkins beside her, her voice breaking. "Lydia, oh God, no." Inspector Reed stepped forward, his expression grim. "Miss Lydia Beaumont, you're under arrest for the murder of Sir Reginald Harrington." Miss Marple watched as P.C. Hargreaves escorted Lydia from the room, her knitting needles still in her lap. "A tragic thing, human nature," she murmured to Eleanor. "So full of passion, and so prone to error." The room was silent, save for Amelia's sobs and the crackle of the fire. The maze had yielded its secret, and the truth, sharp as a blade, had cut through the lies at last. Chapter 11. The reflection the morning after Lydia Beaumont's arrest broke over Thornwood Manor with a fragile clarity, the clouds parting to reveal a pale sun that cast long, tentative shadows across the estate. The maze, its yew walls still, glistening from the recent rains, stood silent, no longer a labyrinth of terror, but a somber monument to the tragedy that had unfolded within its depths. The household, though released from the immediate grip of suspicion, moved with a subdued air, as if the weight of Sir Reginald Harrington's murder and Lydia's confession had left an indelible mark on their souls. Eleanor Prescott, her mind, still reeling from the dramatic confrontation in the drawing-room, found Miss Jane Marple in the library, where the elderly spinster was packing her knitting into her wicker basket. The pale blue scarf, now complete, lay folded neatly beside her, a quiet testament to the patience and precision that had unraveled the mystery. Miss Marple's grey dress and shawl were as unassuming as ever, but her blue eyes held a depth of understanding that Eleanor had come to admire profoundly. "Miss Marple," Eleanor said, settling into a chair opposite her, "it's over, isn't it? Lydia's confession. It was so sudden, so heartbreaking. I can scarcely believe it." Miss Marple's lips curved into a gentle smile, though her expression carried a trace of melancholy. "Yes, my dear, it is over, in a manner of speaking, but the end of a mystery is never quite the end of its echoes. Like a stone dropped in a pond, the ripples linger." Eleanor nodded, her thoughts turning to the shattered household. Lady Amelia, devastated by her sister's actions, had taken to her room, refusing visitors. Victor Harrington, cleared of suspicion, was grappling with his own guilt over his strained relationship with his father. Clarissa, her ambitions curtailed, had grown quiet, her elegance dimmed by the scandal. Desmond Forbes, though untouched by the crime, faced scrutiny over his financial dealings, his cool demeanour fraying at the edges. Reverend Hale and Mrs. Grantham, peripheral yet shaken, had returned to St. Mary Mead, their gossip now tempered by the gravity of what they had witnessed. Inspector Reed, his case closed, had departed for the county station with Lydia in custody, his hawkish features softened by a grudging respect for Miss Marple's insight. Before leaving, he had stopped by the library to thank her, his tone formal but sincere. "You've a sharp mind, Miss Marple," he'd said. "I'll not underestimate a village spinster again." Miss Marple had merely smiled, her needles clicking softly. "Kind of you, Inspector. But it's only observation. You know, people are much the same, whether in St. Mary Mead or a grand estate like this." Now, alone with Eleanor, Miss Marple set her basket aside and gazed out the window, where the maze loomed in the distance. "It's a curious thing, human nature," she mused, her voice soft but resonant, "so full of love and loyalty, yet so easily twisted by fear and pride." Lydia Beaumont loved Thornwood as if it were her own child, and when Sir Reginald threatened to carve it up, she saw her world crumbling. Not an excuse, mind you, but an explanation. Eleanor frowned, her mind replaying the clues that had led to the truth of bloodied pruning shears. The sketch in Lydia's notebook, the shadow in the maze, you saw it all so clearly. Miss Marple, the cigarette, the shawl, the rust. Did you know they pointed to Lydia? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression was tinged with sadness. "I didn't, at first. Those clues were like stitches in a pattern, each one suggesting a shape but not the whole. The cigarette was a distraction, Mr. Forbes's carelessness, not guilt. The shawl placed Mrs. Harrington near the pavilion, but her loyalty to Victor was her true secret, not murder. The rustle, though, and the shears, they spoke of someone who knew the maze intimately, someone who carried tools as naturally as I carry my knitting." Lydia's passion for Thornwood was her strength and her undoing. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice low. And Amelia's confession about Lydia's argument with Sir Reginald was the key, wasn't it? Yes, Miss Marple said, nodding. Grief loosens the tongue, my dear. Amelia's fear for her sister betrayed the truth, though she didn't realize it. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a woman who confessed her brother's theft to save him from worse. Love, you see, can be as revealing as guilt. They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Eleanor's thoughts turned to the maze, its twisting paths a mirror for the tangled motives of the household. The maze, she said, it felt like a trap for us all. Do you think Lydia planned it, or was it a moment of madness? Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, her voice thoughtful. A bit of both, perhaps. Lydia knew the maze as her own heart, and when Sir Reginald mocked her devotion, that heart broke. The shears were in her hand, the pavilion a place of confrontation, not planned, but not entirely impulsive. Like Mr. Grayson in my village, who struck a man in anger over a trifle. The act was sudden, but the roots ran deep. Eleanor sighed, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. You make it sound so simple, Miss Marple. Yet without you, we might never have seen the truth. Miss Marple chuckled softly, her hands folding over her scarf. Nonsense, my dear. The truth was always there, waiting to be noticed. I merely looked where others didn't tend to the small things, the human things. A village is a microcosm, Eleanor. What happens in St. Mary Mead happens everywhere, only the scale changes. As the sun climbed higher, casting a golden light over the gardens, Miss Marple rose, her basket in hand. I must be off, my dear. My nephew will be expecting me, and I have a train to catch. But do keep an eye on this household. They'll need time to heal, and you've a good heart for it. Eleanor stood, her eyes misting. Will you come back to St. Mary Mead soon? Oh, I expect so, Miss Marple said, her smile warm. There's always a mystery or two brewing, even in a quiet village. And my knitting, you know, is never quite finished. She walked to the door, her step light but purposeful, and paused to glance back. Take care, Eleanor. And remember, people are never quite what they seem, but they're always what they do. With that, Miss Marple stepped into the hall, her figure diminishing as she made her way to the manor's entrance. Eleanor watched her go, a sense of awe mingling with gratitude. The maze of Thornwood Manor had been navigated, its secrets laid bare by a woman who saw the world through the lens of a village spinster. As the sun warmed the earth, Eleanor felt a quiet resolve to carry forward Miss Marple's lesson, to look closely, to listen carefully, and to trust the small truths that lead to the greatest revelations.